In this segment, we explore human factors in device design. So when we talk about humans' interactions with devices, there are two primary sides. There is the control interface, how you get a device to do what you want it to do, and there's the display interface, how do you interpret the data that your device acquires. On the control side, these sorts of things seem very logical, but you'd be surprised how many examples there are where the device designer did not consider the user. There may be individual controls, there may be multiple controls, and you need to select controls that work with what the user's expectations are, that are easy to interpret, and that are arranged in such a way, especially when you have multiple controls, that they're easy to find and easy to operate, especially in high stress situations such as found in a hospital. The selection of a control is going to depend on a lot of different factors, including what the nature of the task is the user is trying to accomplish, how much precision is required, and how much force the user is going to have to put out to operate that control. So, for example, if you see this figure on the right-hand side, is there a discrete motion that needs to happen, or is it a continuous choice of control? Discrete choices of control may be a simple toggle switch or a button. Continuous controls may require a knob or a foot pedal. How large is the force that's going to be required to do this operation, and how will this translate to the user? Will you need to use something like a foot pedal for a larger amount of force, or something like a small finger control if it's just a small amount of force is going to be required by the user? You also have to consider how compatible your control operation is going to be with what humans typically expect. So there's some usual expectations that humans have for where controls are laid out and the kind of motion. So for example, if you think about it, and these are all again very common sense, flipping a switch up tends to mean something. Usually up means that you're turning it on, at least in the Western Hemisphere. You're turning something on, you're increasing something. When you flip a switch down, it tends to mean you're turning it off or you're disengaging something. Clockwise and counterclockwise means different things in different uses. For example, you may be most familiar with the use of clockwise and counterclockwise for turning on and off spigots for fluids. So when you turn them clockwise, you're turning off the fluid. When you turn them counterclockwise, you're turning off on the fluid. However, for currents, it's the opposite. When you go clockwise, you're increasing current, and when you turn it counterclockwise, you're decreasing current. So these kind of human expectations can affect the use of controls. An important thing to consider when there are multiple controls that need to be operated by the same user is how can you group these so they make the most sense for the user. Usually when there are multiple controls, they need to be used as part of a sequence of actions. So when you arrange these controls, you need to consider what the normal sequence is that a user will engage in, and what are the user's expectations for these, and what are they going to need to access them most frequently. Keyboards are really very complicated when you consider them, and the layout is different for different countries. So what we have, the typical QWERTY keyboard in the US, it's not necessarily something that logically comes to mind if you're just looking at it, but as you train yourself to use it, it does make sense, and that keys that are used the most frequently, at least in English, are laid out where they're the most easily accessible by the most dexterous of the fingers that will be used to operate those particular letters. So as you can see, the selection and placement of controls is a very common sense kind of procedure if only you take the time to think about what the user might want to do or needs to do in the use of this device. On the other side is how the device communicates to the user. So in the design of quantitative displays, how much information and how precisely does the user need to understand what comes from the device? Does it need to be to very high decimal places? Does it need to be extremely precise? Or is it just a qualitative call? In quantitative displays, you need to know with great precision what the information is that's coming from the device. So exactly what temperature, exactly what speed, even down to several decimal places. You can do this as an analog display, as shown here, or it may be displayed in digital, which can be more precise and leaves less subject to the interpretation of the user. In qualitative displays, however, it's not as important to know exactly the value to the fine decimal points. You may just need to know the degree of the value, how warm, how hot, how cold, like in a car. How close are you to being out of oil? You don't need to know exactly the number of liters or fraction of liters that's present in the vehicle. So qualitative is usually not presented in digital form, but in some sort of a dial. Or it may be a toggle if you just need to know that you're low. Another factor to consider in designing controls and displays is the human themselves, the human's physical capabilities. Anthropometrics is a science that looks at measurements of groups of humans so that you have some statistical data describing the typical size or shape or weight of a human or how much force they can put out, so that you can think about what your intended user population is and what size or force you might put into the controls. So for example, something that's designed for users with large hands, where the typical user would have large hands, may be different than something that's designed for a user that typically has small hands. Something designed for children should be very different than something designed for adults, for example. Considering the human physical characteristics is important in that you don't want to fatigue the user if there's something that's a repetitive motion, and this can cause injury in the workplace and result in the loss of many, many billions of dollars in injury or workman's compensation. So as we said, it can be very commonsensical, but just a simple thing of a knob, how much force needs to be put on that knob, and do you need to perhaps put a lever arm to make it easier for the user? On the other hand, would a lever arm give you too much leverage and cause too much motion on that control? Those are simple things that you should be considering when you design your own device interfaces. Finally, ergonomics is an area that receives a lot of attention now, a lot due to repetitive motion and worker injuries in the workplace. And that's a study of knowing human capabilities and limitations and how to design that machine or device or product so that it's safe and it's efficient and it's comfortable for the person to use, especially repeatedly over time. This desk, for example, looks pretty uncomfortable to me, but this man finds it pretty usable. May not be the best thing for every situation. So there's a possibility that in the design of your device, you may be targeting to a particular user group, and you would need to specify that, and you may design a different interface for another consumer group or another user population. So really, human factors is just putting the time to think about who the user will be for this device and how can you make the interface the most logical, easy to interpret for that user without having a huge list of pages and pages of user manual explanations to explain how your device works. So the more that something can be interpreted very easily by the user without written information, the better.